所以这个第一个标本是一个 ascites 的标本，然后它上面有 label，它是 pigtail，它就是一个 drainage 的 ascites， 61岁的女生，然后她有 high grade serous carcinoma。好，所以在这边你可以看到，好，蛮明显的，就是很多 high grade 的 carcinoma 的 cell。那它有典型的 glandular 的 feature， 好，包含就是它的这个 cytoplasm 有非常多的这个空泡，然后细胞核是大颗，然后 vesicular 的 chromatin， 然后那个核仁也是算是蛮清楚的。那很多单颗的啊，这边有一些有这种泡泡偏核的这种样子，然后这边有看到散膜妈巴底。所以这个正中央有这个同心圆的钙化，好，所以这个是典型的 high grade serous carcinoma。那我们 ovarian cancer 常常就是发现的时候，肚子就是到处都是这样子，好，所以这个算是很常见的一个 finding。好，下一个也是一样，也是一个 high grade serous carcinoma，这是同个人吗？对，同一个人哎，好，所以这个也是同一个人，好，所以他有的时候会送好多套，好，所以这个是同一个人，奇怪，好，那这个好像是手术当中的挖寻的啦，好，所以一样你可以看到就是细胞很多，那低背底下有一些成团的，那可是挖寻的时候有一些时候成团的并不是 tumor 啦，好，所以在这边你可以看到这个成团的好像还好，可是旁边那个单颗的就超级大颗，对不对？好，所以这个旁边的这些看起来应该才是 cancer， 好，所以这个跟刚刚是同一个病人。再来看 pleural effusions 是这个 lung， 好，所以这个病人原本是有 lung cancer 的 history， 然后是有在做治疗，好，是 EGFR L858R 的 mutation， 好。那所以就是我们在用这种 TKI 的药物治疗，大概2年左右的时间，哈，会 recur 的病人就会开始准备要 recur 了，哈，所以在这边你可以看到很小团，蛮 scattered 的，它的肿瘤的量没有很多，那可是看起来应该算是明显的是这个恶性的细胞，好，那这边也是，好，所以它的量其实不多，好，所以我们在这种有 history 的病人，好，看是否复发。那有的时候它的量其实很少，啊，有的时候是单颗，好，不会是一团一团看起来很明显的那种样子。下一个病人，好，这个也是让，好，也是 EGFR， 好，他是19 deletion 的病人，好，那这个也是怀疑 recurrence 啦，好，所以在这边你可以看到低背底下我们有看到蛮多成团的，好，所以 two cell population 蛮清楚的，好，然后放到高背底下你可以看到，好。跟刚刚那个蛙型不一样，因为刚刚那是蛙型的，我们这边成团的，如果是就是直接是 fluid 的 aspiration， 我们这些成团的就是很大颗，好，所以这个比较像是我们常看到典型的 lung cancer 啦，好，所以这个就是复发应该是蛮明确的，好，所以立体的团块 overlapping， 细胞核大，核仁清楚，好，然后呈这种立体的线体排列，好，所以这个也是 positive， 好。好，那我们比较少看到的是colon cancer， 好，所以我们 colon cancer 偶尔啦，好，大部分的情况之下，我们很少看到它破掉跑到肚子里面。好，那这个病人除了这个肚子的话，好，这个是一个 pleural effusion， 好，所以它已经从横膈膜下方跑到上方了，好，那在这个 pleural effusion 低背底下。背景好像很干净，可是它的细胞很多是成团块的，这个看起来就有一些异常了哈，好像看不到什么 normal component， 就是一些立体的团块。好，那我们放到高倍来看哈， 这些立体的团块大概没什么问题哈，你放到哪里都会觉得它是一个 adenocarcinoma 嘛，好，那它的核仁清楚，然后呢，它还有看到明显的这个mitosis 的样子跑出来，好，然后呢，这个呈的这种比较 tubular 的排列。那它跟一般的 colon cancer 看到比较常见的 necrosis， 然后就是 tall columnar cell 比较不一样了哈，所以这个好像比较是小的 tubular 的这种 architecture。好，那不过有这个 history， 这个应该是转移的 adenocarcinoma 没有问题。那病史是 colon 的话，那我们就是配合哈 compatible 是 colon cancer 的转移。好，然后我们来看超析哈。So this is the thyroid aspiration, and this is from our branch hospital. So we only have the direct smear. So when we interpret the salivary gland aspiration, we will usually pay attention first. On low power, we will see if there is any background material, such as colloid or cystic fluid background. So for this specimen, it looks a little bit weird because the background seems to be relatively clean, but with some very dense, like a material in the background. Additionally, we also see fragments of cells along with the smearing direction, and it looks like a fibrovascular stroma. So in the background, we have some dense we have some dense colloid type of material, but very dense, along with some cellular fragments. But the smearing artifact is quite prominent, so it's a little bit difficult to see through the details of the cells. But here we do have some more cells. So when we go to higher power, the cells show prominent oncocytic change, which includes increase of the size of the cells and with abundant cytoplasm. The texture of the cytoplasm is quite densely granular. Additionally, the nuclear size is also increased. It's centrally located, and you can see occasional distinct nucleus. So the cellular change is consistent with the oncocytic change. So in this situation, if what we have only is the predominant cell population is these type of oncocytic cells, so we need to think about the possibility of oncocytic neoplasm. However, like what we said before, when you see prominent oncocytic population, we still need to pay attention to the background if there is any colloid or any lymphocytes, because it's not uncommon that in the situation of Hashimoto thyroiditis, you can also see some oncocytic nodule presenting similar to a tumor, but it is not a tumor. So I think for this specimen, we have quite prominent population of oncocytic cells. In the background, we also see some colloid, but it's more like a dense colloid. It's more like a tumor type of colloid instead of goiter, hyperplastic type of thin colloid. The specimen was not optimal. So I think it is okay that we call these AUS with Herschel cell or oncocytic aspirates, because we have oncocytes, but in the background we still see a little bit of colloid and uncertain if there is any lymphocytes. And because this is coming from the branch hospital, we have limited clinical information of the case. So the next specimen is a bone aspiration cytology. So the patient had a history of lung adenocarcinoma. This is the direct smear. So in this smear, we do see some tight aggregates of atypical cells. A lot of these cells, interestingly, have these intracytoplasmic mucin in the cytoplasm, which is relatively uncommon for lung adenocarcinoma. But it is definite for metastatic adenocarcinoma. So we can sign it out as positive adenocarcinoma. And because the patient had a concurrent biopsy specimen, so they can go ahead to do immunohistochemistry on the biopsy specimen to confirm the origin of the lesion. This is quite uncommon that you can see so many like signaling cell population. So maybe the patient have the second tumor. So again, move back to the thyroid. So this is another thyroid aspiration. In this specimen, this is the liquid-based preparation. We can appreciate that we have tight cohesive cluster, but no colloid in the background. So when we go to the higher power, we can appreciate that the nucleus of these cells demonstrate typical nuclear feature of a papillary thyroid carcinoma. Especially, you can appreciate that there is an intranuclear inclusion. Okay. So this is positive TBS 6 for PTC. So we have classic low power feature, although the cellularity is not very high, but the background is clean, and we have like a flattened sheets as well as these tubular papillary fragments. And then we go high power and we identify typical nuclear feature of PTC. So this is our basic diagnostic workflow for papillary thyroid carcinoma. So another case of thyroid, and this is also coming from the branch hospital. So for this specimen, again, first of all, you see this is a direct smear. In the background, it is very, very clean. So you only have some blood, no colloid, and that's it. Additionally, you have cluster of cells. On low power, you can appreciate that it is very rich in the stromal cells and looks a little bit like a papillary architecture. But you go to higher power and you can start to appreciate that these are actually not the usual type of papillary stroma, but this is a fibrovascular stroma, and it is have a relationship with these tight microfollicular architecture. And in the center of these microfollicles, you can see very dense globule type of dense colloid. And the nuclear feature of these cells, they were just only slightly enlarged, still maintain a rounded nucleus, and with a vague, like a ground glass type of pattern. So this is a typical feature of a RAS type nucleus. So not a papillary thyroid carcinoma nucleus. So the difference is mainly the degrees of ground glass pattern, as well as relatively smooth and rounded nucleus comparing to the irregular nucleus and elongated of the PTC. So basically, we have this type of fibrovascular stroma, suggesting that this is a vascular rich lesion, and it has a very close relationship with a lot of microfollicles. So this is consistent with follicular neoplasm. Even though we don't have the image finding, the cytology itself is consistent with the follicular tumor. So for this case, we will call this TBS4, suspicious for follicular neoplasm. And just I want to emphasize again, in our category, if it is a category 4 TBS, for the report we don't say suspicious, okay? This is because this is not suspicious for malignancy, this is suspicious for follicular neoplasm, so you have to keep the category blank, okay? So this is TBS4, suspicious for follicular neoplasm. So thyroid, again, this is a direct smear because the original liquid-based cytology was very scant in cellularity. So for this case, on low power, it looks very similar. So in the background, it's clean. We only have some blood. And along with the blood clots, you see the stromal cell looks like a papillary. And there are a lot of cells associated with this stromal component. So whenever we see these, we need to go to higher power to check the nucleus detail as well as whether these are microfollicles or not. So on low power, it looks quite similar to the prior case. So on higher power, you can start to appreciate some of these cells have relatively irregular, like not smooth, but angulated type of nucleus, a little bit elongated. So the nuclear feature seems to be suspicious. So if we find the nuclear feature is suspicious, then we would need to go to more flattened area to check if there is any unequivocal feature of PTC. So again, here we have overlapping nucleus, not particularly arranged in the microfollicular patterns, and a lot of these cells are angulated, elongated with a very vague grooves. So here again seems to be like a papillary fragment, detached papillary fragments, and with some luminal borders, and the nuclear feature of the cells and also looks quite atypical. So here again, this is what I call this abortive, like a papilla. So you have three aspects showing these luminal type of pattern and one blunted end, and the nucleus more ground glass, more irregular, more elongation. So in this case, this is consistent with the papillary thyroid carcinoma. Despite the low power architectural pattern seems to be quite similar to the prior case, and then here you find the intranucleus pseudo inclusion over here, and there's another one over here. So this is diagnostic for papillary thyroid carcinoma. So occasionally in thyroid aspiration cytology, we will encounter parathyroid lesion. So this is a very classic example of a parathyroid lesion. And if you check it with the requisition sheets, the patient has highly elevated PTH level because he is under hemodialysis for a long time. So this is a secondary parathyroid hyperplasia. So on low power, you can appreciate that in the background, there is no colloid at all. And we have these quite complex papillary branching architectures, and with very small, like hyperchromatic cells. But these cells are all very uniform. Okay, so this is a classic example of a parathyroid lesion, and the patient do have clinical like an impression of a hyperparathyroidism, and you can appreciate this very delicate capillary meshwork and arranging a very complex papillary type of architecture. So we will usually use immunostain to confirm. The stain of choice is GATA3. GATA3 is not entirely 100% specific because, as we know, it can also be positive in ductal differentiated cells or urothelial cells. But if the consideration is papillary, parathyroid lesion versus thyroid lesion, it is very useful because it would be only positive in the parathyroid lesion. Additionally, we also have PTH with immunostain, and because we rarely order that, it is almost going to be cancelled, so we will also order a PTH for this case. Otherwise, it will be cancelled. So we have a couple pap smear. So this is a 49-year-old female. So this is a screening setting. So on low power, we can already appreciate some of the cells showing these coilosity change. So it has a very clear contour of these intracytoplasmic hollowing, okay? But the nuclear is not particularly hyperchromatic and not particularly big. However, here we have also a more like a high NC ratio type of coilocytic cells. So when you identify these type of cells, just along the smearing direction, you will expect to see more. And until we got more and more comfortable cytomorphology, we can call these low CO. So again, intermediate cells, increase size of the nucleus, hyperchromasia, and coilosity chain. So it's getting there, so it's likely a low CO. And so we have more than these. So again, we have like a binucleation, hyperchromasia, coilosity chain. So this is pretty good for low CO. So we will send this out as low CO case. So if you have some cells with intermediate feature and with relatively scant cellularity for that, so here is a very vague, like a very vague coilocytes. The contour is not very clear. And along the smearing direction, there seems to be a few of these type of cells with a relatively like a smaller nucleus, binucleation, but no hyperchromasia, and with these type of vague coilosity change. So it's not getting there because this is not very hyperchromatic and the cells are relatively limited. So in this situation, it is okay that we just call these ascus. Okay? So sometimes if you see these and you do the biopsy, there's nothing there because it's not very prominent. So for this type of case, we will call these ascus. And then if you have a cluster of cells looks like this, so it's kind of beyond what we can call as low CO. So the patient has a past history of a high CO last year who received cone biopsy. Originally, the margin was free, so this is a follow-up smear. But when you see something like this is already beyond the low CO because you see the NC ratio is much higher, the nucleus is much bigger and much hyperchromatic. So this is consistent with the CIN2. So this is already high CO, not the low CO. Okay, so here in the background we can see other cells. So if this is what we only have, maybe ask us, but this is too much. And if you go through the smearing direction, so you can find occasionally these ascus type of cells. Okay, but this is already a high CO because we have definite like a cellular population showing the high CO feature. So this is CIN2. So now we have high CO case. We will do a 5-year review. For this case, the patient is actually received prior treatment at the outside hospital. So this is the first specimen in our hospital. So the next case, this is relatively young patient, 44-year-old female. She had a past history of high CO and the AIS, and with cone biopsy. And so she was under the follow-up. The original cone was, the margin was focally positive for AIS. So this is relatively a difficult smear to interpret because in the background there was a lot of inflammation composed mainly of PMN. So there were some cluster looks very hyperchromatic. But this type of pattern make you wonder if this is coming from the endometrium with a phagocytosis, or is this just overlapping of these PMN over these like a hyperchromatic cluster? So we have hyperchromatic crowded groups, which is one of the most challenging like cytological finding, because you need to determine first, when we encounter these, we need to determine is this squamous or this glandular, okay? So for those cluster, I find it's very difficult. For this one, it's also very difficult. But remember, because the patient had a history of AIS plus high CO, so these need to be considered because the patient already had a past history. So when you realize that this looks a little bit like stratification pattern in the AIS, so because AIS is frequently concurrent with high CO, so sometimes a high CO with glandular involvement can present as a very similar finding as a typical glandular cluster. So I find this very difficult because these seems to be degenerated, but still in the background you see PMN everywhere. So these may not be coming from the endometrium. I think this can still be a squamous lesion. And plus the nucleus hyperchromatic and with some coarse chromatin pattern. The unusual finding is that it seems to be more degenerated than it should be. So I think for this cluster is more toward a definite AIS. Despite we do not see the feathering type of pattern, so these stratified nuclei haven't go outside of the lumen, but it's very hyperchromatic and the shape of the nucleus is very strange. And additionally, I think these cells may look more likely to be squamous cells instead of a glandular cell. So this is a highly like a reactive smear, but still with some like seems to be positive cells. So then, so I decided, because also the patient had the past history, so I decided that we should just call them both. So I call these as AIS plus high CO. Just make the clinician just go ahead to do more like a confirmation for these cases, because these cluster indeed looks very strange. So the limitation of the smear can be interfered by the condition of the like a local inflammation. So for this specimen seems to be like locally inflamed. So this looks more like a endocervical type of gland, and this is hyperchromatic and maybe some feathering type of pattern. So So finally, I decided, yeah, we should just call these AIS plus high seal because D cell does looks very atypical, very hyperchromatic, and has some AIS plus squamous feature. So we just call these AIS plus high seal. So that's for all the case today. Thank you.